Can they acknowledge the pleasures of the unknown? It may be, as Foucault once wrote, quote, that the West has not been capable of inventing new pleasures, unquote. He's talking about sex, but it'll do. But if we can still activate, ethically and politically, that patient labor from which new forms of freedom might emerge, then perhaps we will find ourselves committed to a patience that precisely in creating new spaces of freedom creates new orders of pleasure. New pleasures and new forms of freedom describes my own experience of free improvisation. Nothing is guaranteed. Each of us must decide if this ethos is worth the trouble and the risks. And now this is my concluding page. It should go without saying that improvisation as a way of life does not mean that every moment of life will be freely improvised. Much of everyday life calls for some improvisation. We do not live a composed life. But of that species of improvisation we might call constrained or delimited, that is improvisation against the background of certain limiting constraints. Free improvisation aims to minimize, modify, disrupt these constraints. It is here that improvisation most fully becomes an experimental work on what is presented to us as our natural or inevitable limits. My claim here, to be more explicit, is that with respect to everyday life, the main task is not to locate its improvisatory moments, which are typically numerous, even indeterminate, but to identify those dimensions of our life that are not usually subject to improvisation, but remain fixed and often invisible, and provide a stabilized framework of constraints within which we improvise. This framework may be more or less extensive for different individuals, but it is hard even to imagine a life that is completely composed, scored or scripted in every dimension, and thus thoroughly predictable, a routine determined and known in advance. The rigidity of such a life would resemble a mechanism without vitality, rather than a lived experience in which we are called upon to invent responses to new situations in interactive conversation with others. The what and when of improvisatory invention, what we improvise and when we improvise, is precisely that which requires the kind of attention that can make possible new forms of freedom, allowing us to disrupt our fixed framework and introduce creativity where previously we were constrained by habit. No life should be the endless repetition of the same melody, and we should sometimes attempt to experiment without having to lean on any identifiable and so reassuring melody. Stability and comfort are not the only orientations to life. If the unexamined life is not worth living, neither is the unimprovised life. Through an attentive examination of our practices, what we should try to do is to make our improvisations as broad and responsible, as forceful and intelligible as our capacity for creative discomfort will allow. The space of liberty is up to us. In this way of life, self-transformation intertwined with social formation will occupy the center of our ethical and political work. Not everyone will want such work, and to those who refuse it, I can only say, and I will end with this quote from Michel Foucault, the one that's up there, as to those for whom to create trouble for themselves, to begin and begin again, to try, to be mistaken, to take everything up again from top to bottom, and still to find the means to hesitate from moment to moment. As to those for whom, in short, to work while acting with reserve and restlessness is equivalent to abdication, well, we are not, it is evident, from the same planet. So I am now going to turn over to George, who is from my planet, the next half hour of our presentation.
Well, thank you, Arnold. Well, this is an excellent place to begin, and I saw so many points that are going to relate to what's going to happen when Terry comes. There was a strong, something you mentioned here had strong resonance with something I found just yesterday from a quotation from Terry. And you know, the thing is that, I guess for me, in this sense, the scholarship on it proceeds from, you know, self-interest. You see it all the time. You know, someone likes, you know, whatever, they like something and they decide to study it in a very deep way. And oftentimes that gets identified with larger cultural or societal goals, and that's really how it is for me, my work on improvisation, because it does draw on my experiences as an artist in pursuing, critical discussion of discourses surrounding improvisation. And I've sort of come to feel that these discourses really do have profound implications for the evolution of new musical practices, but also for the construction of new discourses that sort of go beyond the musical or the aesthetic or the artistic. And so one intent, for at least this part of the talk for me, is to acquaint us with some of the processes through which the study of improvisation already informs a rather large array of fields of inquiry and areas of practice in the arts, in the humanities, and the social sciences. And the guiding premise here is that the study of improvisation presents not only a new and wide-ranging topic for critical inquiry, but also a radically interdisciplinary animating paradigm for scholarship itself. So that gets me to the standard question that I often have, which is, well, why study improvisation, okay? For me, it started in really many years ago, but it came to a head in my scholarly work as distinct from artistic practice, a residency I co-led in 2002 at the University of California's Humanities Research Institute on improvisation in the contemporary performing arts. We had historians, new media artists, technology researchers, artists, anthropologists, musicologists, dance theorists, and people who really evaded attributions of field and specialization. And these are just some of the claims that we had, and some of the others may overlap. I'm not going to read these, because actually there are others. We felt that improvisation mediated cross-cultural and transnational exchanges and produced new conceptions of identity in the body. We felt that sort of word, which I've sort of made up myself, improvisative, production of meaning and knowledge. It's hard to say unless you kind of let it roll off your tongue, Sort of like performative, and you kind of like take a little twist, improvisative, Production of meaning and knowledge provides models for new forms of social mobilization, embodies history, memory, agency, difference, personal narrative, self-determination, and fosters socialization and acculturation and community development. So that's a pretty strong agenda, and any practice for which those kinds of claims could be sustained, you really want to study that pretty widely and in depth. And so, and as an opening gambit here, I'd like to begin with an old epigram that I'm sure Arnold is familiar with. And here Gilbert Ryle, one of probably his old buddies, speaking of the normal human, saying that if he is not at once improvising warily, and this is a very late essay by Ryle, he is not engaging in somewhat trained wits in some momentarily live issue, but perhaps acting from sheer unthinking habit. And I'd like to point out here, this precisely reverses, let's say, Western music's notion that improvisation actually breaks habits. In other words, it's not improvising that depends upon habitual in Ryle's schema here. So thinking, I now declare quite generally, is at the least the engaging of partly trained wits in a partly fresh situation. It is the pitting of an acquired competence or skill against an unprogrammed opportunity, obstacle, or hazard. It's a bit like putting new wine into some old bottles. And this discussion really, I think, neatly encapsulates the critical reasons why we should be interested in improvisation. Now, if we can conclude with Arnold and with Ryle that improvisation is essential, and I'm going to say even a ubiquitous practice of everyday life, a primary method of meaning, exchange, and any interaction, then one should find it to be a critically important site for both humanistic and scientific study. And the thing is, though, that improvisation is everywhere, but it's really hard to see because of its the fundamental nature of improvisation is the existence and survival of human formations, from the individual to the community, the post-national body to the species itself. And this brings us as close to universal as contemporary critical method could responsibly entertain. And in that regard, I was happy to find that improvisation, if you're studying this, it puts us kind of at the center of things, even as the myth of our marginality, our academic subalternity, if you will, is ever more anxiously repeated. So the